thank you all for coming. I thought about 3 people would be here. I mean, astrology is fringe enough as it is, but fertility is even more fringe. So thanks for joining me. And thank you, Margaret, for taking it on and publishing it. That's been a very, very long ride. I think when I started writing the book, it was about 10 years ago. Don't laugh. This many pages in 10 years. Oh, thank you. And I originally started with Margaret, and Margaret was going to publish it, and then we both, Margaret went on another journey of her own, and I had to find somebody else to fill in. And the book had about three rights, and what started off as a very sort of naive collection of case studies became a more academic, how can I say, framing of astrology. And finally it's now merged into a really nice, I think, integration of a textbook and other people's stories and an introduction into narrative medicine, or how astrology can be part of narrative medicine. So the problem as an astrologer, because that's where I started with the story, is that there aren't many texts on fertility per se in our scriptures or in the texts that are coming out and being translated recently. So while it's unusual, because you would think that fertility is such a human condition and that there must have been a lot of material, or at least a lot of people asking the question, how am I going to get pregnant, or when am I going to get pregnant? Because, as you know, from my astrology is mostly medieval, and the question of having an heir was, a life or death situation. So it was a great source of surprise to me that there wasn't enough material written about specifically fertility astrology. The only person in the history of astrology, and I'm going back some 2,000 years, is Omar of Tibaras. And his astrology gave me the one technique, or the one, it's an algorithm that I use called the Almutin of pregnancy. And so if you know anything about astrology, that Almutin has unlocked for me a lot of the predictive technique that I'm using in my practice today, and that I use in my app as well. So I do have an app, and I've actually programmed that app with this Almutin. So why fertility? Well, 1 in 6 couples struggles with infertility. And so as a practicing astrologer, if you are dealing with people, you know that you are going to be asked the question sooner or later, when am I going to get pregnant? An amusing anecdote is that when I went to go study astrology, I studied it with a chap called Rod Suskin, and he practiced in a room that he hired in the top of Cape Town. And the room was actually used as an antenatal clinic. So we would wait outside, and the big fat-bellied ladies would come down the stairs, and we'd go up and sit in their warm seats and learn astrology. So maybe, it's all those pictures of the babies on the walls. I don't know. Anyway, what happened after learning astrology with Rod is I started making predictions. You're getting used to your craft. You're getting used to how to use it. And I had 7 ladies come to me within 7 months, and I predicted the exact date of their pregnancies for all 7 of those women. And it was deeply shocking to have a prediction come true, because when it does, it kind of takes all the fun out of it. You imagine that you're going to spend the first 15 years of your life practicing prediction and then getting something right. And to get something right so soon and not understand how or why you did it was a bit daunting. So that's the kind of thing that focused me to understanding, okay, I saw that, but why? So that's where I started. Sadly, those women, they were great advertisers of my practice, but then I only got the problem children. So instead of having all the natural, spontaneous 30-year-old pregnancies, I suddenly started seeing women in their late 40s, late 30s and 40s trying to get pregnant. So it's very difficult to say how successful my predictive techniques are, because firstly, I'm not the one doing the pregnancy test, so I don't get a positive or a negative. I'm not the person to give them that happy news. And also, people are struggling. People have very real issues. So you can't say that the astrology is inaccurate just because the astrology actually verifies or confirms the problems that are there. So a lot of my astrology, I think, is between 75 and 80% accurate in its diagnosis and affirmation of the issues that are in the chart. And Geddes, who's a specialist who does work with me, maybe he can corroborate that later when it comes to question time. But yeah, so this introducing you to Geddes brings me to the next problem is, as an astrologer, is okay, so now you've got this really great technique, you've got this really great ability to help people time their treatments, because astrology is all about time, as you know. And now how are you going to use it without scaring the medical fraternity, and how are you going to use it without coming across as a complete New Age flake? And you have to have women that are able to have a little bit of faith in you, and you have to have a certain amount of authority when you give them advice, and that authority needs to be based on proper ethics, integrity, and proper astrology. And so it's like, how do you bring that and the medical fraternity together? Well, it's very hard, and mostly you don't. And so I started going to these fertility shows at the Olympia in London. So it's like these huge medical convention things where 4,000 people visit over the weekend, and there's the Hammersmith Clinic over there and some Harley Street Clinic over there, and then there's a little booth that says Fertility Astrology over there. And Geddes came along with his Greek friends and said, now what is this all about really? So I had actually had to come up with a way in which to introduce myself to the medical field in a 5-sentence handshake, which wasn't going to irritate them or make me, land me up sort of being dunked in a river somewhere. So the strategy that I took then was to learn more about narrative medicine. And where that led me was to understand that illness has a strange function, because human beings are hardwired for meaning. We all want meaning. Why are we here? What is the purpose of this? And we all have and carry with us ideas about self-identity, ideas about who we are in the world. We create a story around ourselves and our families about where we are in the family, the story of our family and how we fit into it and how we could go forward. We look retrospectively and we discover new stories about ourselves. We have this ongoing feeling for self-identity. So in the books that I was reading and the authors that I was looking at, which include the Kleinmans and Arthur Frank and Shapiro, they were all looking at narrative medicine, and they say illness occurs when there's a biological breach of a narrative. So what happens is that people get ill, and when they get ill is when they say, what does this mean to me? And how can I make sense of this? And so there's, like I said, a genre of study in that narrative medicine. And that was really interesting to me, because any one of you who has been to an astrologer knows that the first thing that astrology tells you is that we are all unbelievably individual, unique, and special, and that our paths and journeys are varied and truly colorful, but they actually only pertain to you. That it's almost, it is so unique. But medicine, traditional modern Western medicine, doesn't take that approach. So traditional modern medicine takes the approach that if you are this age, this body weight, and you fit into that statistic, that category, and these are the tick boxes of symptoms you need to show in order to get those drugs that might help you get pregnant. Whereas astrology is much more, you are a unique individual with a unique timing mechanism built into your system, and nobody else can replicate that, or nobody else, it's not somebody else's path, and this is your destiny. That is what astrology has. So what I learned was that the process of having your chart done is very much about learning your story and learning more about who you are in your world, and the people in your life are populated in the chart. And what astrologers do is they look at the planets, and the planets have symbols, and we take meaning from those symbols. So basically it's a language. We're just using another system. We're going, oh, here's a chart, much like a financial chart or whatever else. Here's a chart, and this is what it means for you. And then if it resonates with the client, then they can take something away and they can deepen it or have more faith in it, and so it goes. And all of the studies in the medical practice of narrative medicine were all alluding to this concept that the placebo studies work because the placebo effect should be actually called a meaning effect. That people get well because they've attributed a meaning to whatever it is they were taking. And they have various levels. There are various levels of placebo effects, and some of them are that the doctor is just that good, that the doctor mentions your name more than 10 times in the consultation, that he touched you, that he had enough certificates on the wall, that his coat was clean. I mean, these are all things that have been researched in Professor Irving Kirsch's studies on the Emperor's New Drugs. That's a book he wrote about it. He's done a meta-analysis of all of these studies, and he's worked out that there are millions of different levels of placebo effects or meaning responses, notwithstanding the ones that we actually talk about when we are talking about somebody else's chart to them. So it just occurred to me, and I just put my hand out to Dr. Geddes and I said, I'm the most sophisticated placebo effect you'll ever meet. And he went, oh, okay, so it's not a science. And I went, you can call me whatever you like, because even fiction heals. So that's my starting point with a medical field, is to say, don't try and prove the astrology or disprove it. Don't try and pick holes in it and ask me to give you empirical research, because astrology is not empirical. It's so highly individual and it's so unique that we can't possibly ever have an RCT trial, because how can you replicate the quality of time? How can you ever have that consult all over again? Negotiate the two worlds that I live in. And it's hard sometimes. I have been chased down the corridors of those medical conferences. There are some doctors who, I don't know what they think, because they haven't taken the time to come and talk to me like Geddes did, but they are threatened, or they feel that that there is no place for faith, or that there is no place for hope in the medical fraternity, which I think is a bit of a problem myself. I think that, if I must be honest, the people in the medical field that I work with, they not only are doctors like Geddes Kritzinkas, but I work with homeopath Victoria Young at the health practice in South Kensington, and I think that when you start working with people who have a genuine desire to help other people heal, and not a desire to just prove their science, or not a desire to peddle more drugs, but who are really interested in what it is that heals people, that's where I think astrology will have its biggest sort of reception, and and hopefully like a warm one. I only hope that it continues. Yeah. So, although this is a textbook, and it's very, very technical, so if you aren't an astrologer, there are chapters here that will terrify you. But if you put the astrology to one side and just read the case studies, Margaret assures me, I mean, it's up to Margaret to convince you. It's hard for me to make this statement about the book, but she says it could be read by other people quite easily, by members of the public. The stories in the book are very human, they're very real. They're all over YouTube if you want to go and have a look at what these people look like. They're actually... they are wonderfully generous in the film and the footage and the information that they've shared with me in order to write up their case studies. And I think you'll enjoy their personal stories a lot. Also, I am the last call, and I know this. And most of the people that have had what I call outstanding results above and beyond are people that have been the most skeptical of astrology, and the people who had the most to overcome in terms of either fear because of their religion. There are a lot of religious people who fear that they are doing something wrong or bad or contra to their faith, and that they're somehow going to get into trouble for it. But they are all desperate. I mean, that is the one common denominator. And so to spend time with me, and even to spend the fee with me, is nothing compared to the grueling journey that they're embarking on in the first place. So, yeah, thanks for bringing that up. One of the gentlemen in this book, his name is Jacques. He is now, he's studying with Rod. He is now on his way to becoming an astrologer. Something more than just his journey with IVF happened. He suddenly just went, no. And he's an engineer, and things for him were very mechanical. But when I sat down with him and we spoke about his self-identity and who he was in the world, he could not believe that an astrology chart could tell so much about somebody else. And he started his own particular journey. So that's been really, it's been lovely for me to watch from the side, that he's developed this whole side of his person. And I think, again, if we go back to Plato, Plato says we are a soul with a body, and by the time we get to Aristotle, who's very evidence-based, we get Aristotle who says we're a body with three souls, different kinds of souls, but we're a body with a soul. And I think that shift is was the start of the breakdown of understanding that the idea about soul having a body, and that the body and that illness is an expression of the soul. So that's my particular personal belief. And I think that when you see somebody who's addressing their soul issues, and like Jacques, who's turning to astrology and trying to open his mind, and you see how it can affect their personal lives, I do have to ask, is that why they went through that infertility journey? Is that why they had to struggle in order for him to find a way to learn something more about the other side of his life, not just his physical life? So that's quite interesting for me. Sorry, deep going down. I'll start like way back from your question, because I know kind of where it's leading to. So there are many reasons why people have children, and I'm not here to judge any of them. But people think that having a child is going to fix a relationship. People think that having a child is going to secure material resources. People think that it's going to make their mothers happy because their mothers are dying of cancer. So I must have a baby now because my mother's dying and she wants to see a grandchild. I mean, these are very real. They're very real reasons for the people having children. That's why I say I don't judge them. And people have different reasons, but they haven't really understood the process, and they haven't understood the implication of perhaps single parenthood, or that if you do have a relationship that's a bit shaky, that a child is not going to fix it. If anything, if there's a crack, it'll find it, and it'll probably break the relationship. Most people are not. How can I say? Intimacy is a funny thing these days. It's far easier to have casual sex than it is to talk about money. So a lot of women our age who are kind of, they've got their own jobs, they have their own careers, they're participating 50-50 in the mortgage, but they still don't really share with their partners how much money they spend on a facial or shoes. Even though it's their money and they're spending it, they feel like, oh my God, now I want to get pregnant, now I've got to tell my partner exactly how much I actually spend every month. And they feel not embarrassed, but it's almost like now they've got to justify something. And so for a lot of women, particularly women who are born around lunchtime, so it's the main luminaries in the 10th house, it's the sun and the moon in the 10th house, they are the ones that have pursued a career. They're the ones that understand that financial independence for them is meaningful, and that they don't want to have to ask their partners for an allowance or for housekeeping money. And so they put off having children until they are financially secure. And then they are financially secure, but now they still don't want to do that thing. So often, where I see financial inequality in a chart, I'll have that very frank conversation with people. And I say, have you decided how you're going to negotiate this after the baby is there? So that it becomes an open, conversation. A lot of women don't understand that having a baby is a risk to your health. And you have every right to ask somebody how they're going to protect you. If you are having their baby and you're sharing their life with them, you do have the right to ask, how am I protected? So I might be pregnant now, but what happens if you die of a heart attack and I'm 9 months pregnant and I have to bring this child up on my own? How are we protected? Do you have an insurance policy? These are questions that I'm shocked that in today's world, 35-year-olds are not having with people that they have been with for 10 years. But it's a common sense thing. But being an astrologer, I get permission to say anything. If you go to a doctor like Eddie's, he's got a medical remit where he can't, but I can say what I like. So yeah. And also, like you said, the commitment to actually having children and what that entails over the next 10 years, 20 years, 28. The thing I do is I'll find out which one of those 7 medieval traditional planets is the Almutin of pregnancy. So the interesting thing about that is that for some people, the Almutin will be Saturn or Mars. So that should immediately trigger you to that age-old question is like, why do some people get pregnant with Saturn in the 5th house and other people don't? So if Saturn is your Almutin of pregnancy, you want it in the 5th house, you want it transiting the 5th house, and likewise with Mars. So you've actually diluted your malefic planets by 50%. And so you actually, it's a bonus. And you start looking at Saturn in a different way. Only to matters of pregnancy, of course, but the joy about what I'm doing is that I'm taking everything out of the equation and I'm only looking at pregnancy. So that's where I start. And then with that, then you see, is it the perfected ruler? Is it unlocked through triplicity rulership? Is it transiting? Are there any solar arcs to or from? And does it trigger any other planet that it already has a relationship with? So that's how I would use it.
Saturn How is that Saturn related to pregnancy?
It's the almutin of pregnancy. So the almutin. So Omar says there's an equation, and there's a work table in the back of the book to work out this thing. Here it is, the almutin worksheet. So there's 7 points that you take into consideration to find out what the almutin of pregnancy is. And the first is it's the ascendant, the ruler of the ascendant, and the term ruler of the ascendant. It's the moon, the ruler of the moon, the fifth house cusp, the degree of the fifth house cusp, the ruler of the fifth house cusp, the position of Jupiter, and any planet bodily present in the fifth house. So you would program your solar fire to work that out, and it gives you that algorithm added up, and one of the 7 planets will be the almutin of pregnancy. And it's more fortunate than not if Saturn or Mars is. So the first house in a chart is the physical body. And so if you do have tricky planets in the first house, you do want to say, have you had proper medical investigations? Are you sure you don't have endometriosis? Are you sure you don't have fibroids? Have you had an ultrasound for your uterus? There are other planets like the moon. So if the moon is conjunct Saturn, we would say broadly speaking that somebody carries with them the narrative of not enough. So moon Saturn people often have low ovarian reserve. They often have a thin lining of the uterus, because the lining of the uterus, the moon is also the uterus in charts. So you need to have a thick enough lining. You need to be, I mean, the kind of detail I can go into is quite a lot. But you would need to also be aware that you can't only go to an astrologer if you are 35 and you are having these issues. You would need medical tests that corroborate and confirm what the astrology is saying, because if not, you need to be moving pretty quickly to some assisted medical treatment. It's going back to that thing about the necessity to move away from fact-based, evidence-based, hard black and white statements or issues about things, and this idea of perspective. So I think in the book I include a parable that an astronomer demonstrates the thing about perspective, and the astronomer is saying to his student, her buck, he's saying to him, when you stand over here and you look over there and you stand still, what do you see? And he's looking over there into the distance in the sky. Of course, all the stars are rising and the stars seem to be moving. He says, if I stand still, the stars seem to be moving. He said, okay, and if you move, then he says, then the stars stand still, but I'm the one who's moving. Which is the truth? And from this parable, then I then conclude that actually when we place ourselves, and this is the geocentric model of the world, when we place ourselves on the earth and stand still, we then become subject, because then the stars move, we become subject to the influences of the planets, not necessarily in a physical way, but from a perspective point of view, because the planet has moved from there to there and I'm in the middle of the world, which positions you in the middle of Plato's cosmos. So for me, it seems like it's a way to deal with what is an illusion and what is the truth, and just get over that. Can we move past that now? So I'll tell you who wrote a lot about sexuality, sexual acts, and who's going to sleep with who and what have you. It was Dorotheus of Sidon and Vettius Valens. And in fact, the Liber Hermetis also mentions some things to do with fertility. But so Dorotheus goes to the Venus and the Moon and sees the debilities and says, if Mars is in Libra, then this person will, have non-mainstream, if you like, relationships. And so that's how they describe it. But nothing particular about getting pregnant. Bonatti has got a way of looking at horary, but don't forget, Bonatti was not a natural astrologer. He was a horary astrologer. So he looked mostly at horary charts. We then get, so I followed them. So then the one person, okay, so Liber Hermetis then goes planet by planet, and every now and again will say, he brought up for me like the social value of appraising planets. So when he says Moon Saturn, this native will be a slave. I mean, this is how these books are written. This native will be a slave. I mean, how's that for a destiny? Here you go. You're a slave. And if you are, or this person's mother is a slave. So you must understand that if your mother is a slave, her health is poor, and the chances are that your nourishment is not going to be great. So we're back at the concept of not enough. So I've had to take from those sources and redevelop them into when those sources were being written, nothing about IVF was being discovered or even spoken about. So I've had to change those slightly to incorporate that shift. But there still wasn't enough. There wasn't, and I think that your point about it being a woman's mystery and that men were the people who wrote and women were the people who spoke, I think that is valid. And then another weird thing happened. So Ficino comes close with his knowledge of medicine and his knowledge of prescribing herbs and ritual and remedy. And then Ficino, Bonatti, more or less the same time period between 1200 and 1400, book ended. But then afterwards, the next cropping up of anything remotely medical or technical is Nicholas Culpeper's Directory for Midwives. And that seems to be an absolute copy of the pseudo-Aristotle's Directory for Midwives. But then Culpeper now, so Culpeper, if you don't know, he was the great English herbalist. And most of you know him from probably like recipe books and cookbooks and everything. He's like, they leave the astrology part out. But anyway, he copied down this treatise of a midwifery from some pseudo-Aristotle. And what he then did was he interspersed it with the folklore and the superstitions of the day. So there's some very strange things, like Culpeper will say, those people over there said you should hang a red squirrel by your bed, but I say that is rubbish. You must rather piss through your wedding ring. Okay. So there's like a lot of that interspersed in between, like I said, folk medicine, but their language, and don't forget I'm now a narrativist, their language is so interesting because Culpeper will talk about somebody's uterus. Her uterus was so angry. No, I'm just remembering the story. Her uterus was so angry, it climbed outside of itself and grew up to strangle her. Now, does that not sound like a stage 4 endometriosis? It's like this, the way that they describe a windy uterus, and they describe a watery uterus, and they describe all kinds of things that we could now go, oh yeah, that sounds like this, and that sounds like that, but they had no way of measuring or finding out. So I find that part with the language that they use is really interesting, that you're being strangled by your uterus. I thought was quite extreme. So Nicholas Culpeper introduces superstition and a certain amount of Victorian. There's a Foucault moment as well where he describes that you cannot get pregnant from a rape. So I think this ushers in, because he was writing that book in 1649, this ushers in the pre-Edwardian and Victorian era. So you then, as a woman, if you're pregnant, then it can't be a rape. You then now have to cover up to make sure. You absolutely have to be sure that you can't even be raped, because you're going to be compromised. So that I found, that inclusion was, and he attributes it to some biblical, Onan and the masturbation thing in the Bible, which I think is completely wrong. And then he also goes, and then he advises, so on the flip side, he advises that I think the ideal time for him, and he's taking straight out of Aristotle, he took straight out of the Greek texts as well, the Greeks in the daily regimen, they said 2 o'clock on a Saturday afternoon after a light lunch of fish and 1 glass of wine apparently was the optimum time. And when the swallows rise, and the swallows rising in Athens would have been when Pisces was rising. So they took everything into account, and they decided that was the correct time. Culpeper copies all of that and then says, but you shouldn't have sex outside because you might get a fright. And that's not going to work, because he then goes on to the psychological aspect. You see, he's now trying to put the psychological overlay, that a fright is going to make, no conception is going to happen. So if you were raped, then he's just endorsing his own statement. So if you were raped, then obviously, if you got a fright, then you can't fall pregnant. But if you got pregnant, clearly you weren't frightened enough. So he does a lot of that throughout his book. And then from Culpeper, nothing in astrology. There's a Jonas theory. The Jonas theory is one that I get most often when I lecture at astrology conferences. It's the common, if you go and Google online, when am I astrologically going to conceive, or how do I get pregnant using astrology, you'll get this long introduction about Dr. Jonas and his methodology, which says that when the sun and the moon, so when we're born, the sun is in a certain place and the moon is in a certain place in the sky. So it'll be a new moon, full moon, crescent moon, whatever. And Jonas said that you were most likely to be pregnant when the sun and moon were in that exact same angle or position in the sky. each and every month. So some people are astute enough and they go, but when that happens, and it's like it's a one-day phenomena actually, when that happens, it might not be the day of ovulation. You might not be, in your fertile phase. So how can that be? I want to say, well, it does. It stands to reason that you can't use that every month, because medical science, and back me up here, Dr. Geddes, medical science even knows that you can't get pregnant every month because for some other reason you don't ovulate, for some other reasons, you don't ovulate every month necessarily. So this astrological technique by Jonas would suggest that you actually could be fertile twice a month. Well, that's not very helpful if you're not falling pregnant. So if you've been trying for 3 years and you can't fall pregnant, that technique's not going to be helpful. Also, the sun and the moon are in an aspect or relationship to one another that can move out of that aspect within one day. So what we do know about conception is that from sexual activity, conception can take 6 days to happen. So the sun and the moon can whiz around the chart. So that technique is not really usable. But it's really hard to explain to people, astrologers, because they like to hang on to this mythological kind of like, oh, when the sun and the moon is in the same place, well, then I'm going to get pregnant.
It's a more simplistic thing, isn't it?
It's I know, and for me, it's like saying, do you use a transit of the sun? No, nobody uses a transit of the sun, but that's how useful that particular technique would be. And also this Jonas person who he pretends to be very scientific. His research is couched in all sorts of academic framework. One of the things that struck me instantly was he's based his entire theory on when people said they had sex. He didn't know they had sex. He wasn't watching them having sex. And as far as I'm concerned, that's not very scientific. Because what I do know about people is that they fictionalize when they're conceived. So nobody puts their hand up and said, yeah, definitely we got pregnant when we had make-up sex after the worst argument we ever had. No one says that. They go, oh yeah, it was our anniversary. We had a lovely meal. Da-da. They will romanticize it. But no one ever says, yeah, it was dirty and horrible. And so what's he working on? What's the data that he's working on? So tricky. So fixed star astrology. So we have planets, and the planets whiz around our charts, and they've got varying different declinations, and but we just use them like on the ecliptic because they move in the ecliptic belt, whereas fixed stars cover the whole sky. So we're now looking at the whole sort of the whole dome of the sky, and the stars rise and set for different locations at different times. So for instance, in Cape Town, there's a grouping of very fertile stars that start rising on the 28th of December and they go all the way through to the 26th of February, one fertile one after the other, and the luckiest of the lucky stars rise at that point. And it's quite interesting to me that when we take the luckiest rising of those stars for Cape Town at 34 degrees south, we get if we count our 40 weeks later, we get the highest birth rate in Cape Town at 34 degrees south. So, and that can be correlated for various other locations too. So it just seems to me that there is a season. Now we know that fixed stars and seasons are how can I say, have got a rhythm to them because they actually do occur at weather patterns. So they will occur in winter or summer or spring. And so there is like an agricultural syncing, if you like. So it's also, people used to get pregnant when it was convenient for them to get pregnant according to the social order and what was going on at the time. So, for instance, the Greeks preferred to get pregnant in winter and give birth in summer because their winters are quite harsh. So your child had more of a... in fact, the Greeks had a whole sophisticated system for that because they first had the Eleusinian mysteries. So, for instance, the fixed star speaker would rise in Athens on about the 13th of September. Everyone would go off to the Eleusinian mysteries to learn all about sex and how to have it and how not to have it and how not to get pregnant. And at the Eleusinian mysteries, they would also give the adherents and the young people that give them ergot and other hallucinogenic drugs. And those hallucinogenic herbs were abortifacients. So it's kind of go and have your party, get it out of your system, learn what's going on. Okay, that's September. Now we are going into winter. Can we have our marriages? So then we get the Libra marriages, and then we go off to being pregnant all the way through winter and give birth in summer. And that was kind of like their social thing, which they synced with the rising and the setting of the stars, but it just also happened to coincide with the whole ritual of life that was going on around them. So for each different latitude, it stands to reason that we've got different weather systems, and at each different latitude you're going to have different planets that are with different stars. So not only do you have different stars rising and setting, but you also have planets that are now linked to those stars. So if you like, the stars are like the theater and the backdrop, and the planets come along and they animate them. So the planets come along and trigger the stories that are happening in those stars. But it's whether that is in your... So often how that pertains to how I would treat my patients is that if somebody has got a choice, particularly in America it seems, a lot of people have a choice about what clinic they want to go to. If there's a more than a 5-degree latitude difference, I'll go and check the stars and compare those places and be able to give somebody a more, favorable place to have the children, but probably at the same time. So I want to see that somebody's having a transit to the almutin of pregnancy at a favorable time. Now I want to see where do I want to having a treatment at that time. So there's time and space. Fixed stars are space, planets are time.
Is there anywhere in the world that's the opposite, particularly infertile places?
Yes, there are. So every place will have its time when it isn't a time for children, but be a time for something else. So very often we know that just think about the 8th house. The 8th house kind of exists because that is the dead part of the sky. That is the gatekeepers. That is the 2 stars, Zubin, El-Ganubi, and the other one who's the claws of the scorpion. And those are the gates between life and death. So that's kind of in the Placidus sort of system, that would be the 8th house cusp, the 8th house of death. Do you see what I'm saying? So it's kind of like there are those places in the sky too, and they will rise. And the idea is that when stars rise and they touch the earth, and the earth has the energy of those stars that walk among them. That's what Brady says.